Cheers and taunts, the booming claps from the home court, the close-up camera shots of hyped-up superfans, all gone. The pandemic robbed fans of the best experiences. Alas, the NBA campus was born. While quarantine campuses have been done in sports such as Supercross, the NBA accomplished a successful quarantine after being interrupted for 3 months at the beginning of the outbreak. I'm Jacob Benson.
And I'm Birkholtz. And this is what you didn't know about the NBA bubble, presented by Unlimited Sports. The bubble worked. Players grinded to finish the season, taking on a toll of having no fans to watch their games for the first time in history. The NBA faced many challenges during the 2020 season. Among the pandemic, the United States saw one of the biggest social justice movements in recent history during the summer. Today, you will hear about the bubble's construction and a female perspective on the NBA, the mental health of players, coaches, and everyone who lived in the NBA campus in 2020, and receive a media member's perspective through the largest quarantine in recent history.
One of the biggest responsibilities of the bubble's creation fell onto Kelly Flato, the Executive Vice President of Global Events for the NBA, who talks to us about how the bubble was formed and how players had a role to play as well. All right, we now welcome on the Executive Vice President of NBA Global Events, Kelly Flato. How are you doing today, Kelly?
I'm great. How are you?
We are fantastic. We are so happy you could join us today. So one thing I wanted to ask you really quick. So I know you're an alumna of American University in DC. So that is an incredibly prestigious school. So could I just hear kind of how your experience was there?
Sure. Thanks for asking. I had an incredible experience in DC. Going to American was about being in a really diverse city with the opportunity to learn from so many adjunct professors that were in the real world, so to speak, and coming out of that with a public communications and advertising degree. It set me up for everything else I've done in my career.
Awesome. Yeah. And going off that advertising. So are you still a member of the Advertising Women in New York?
I haven't been as active a member in recent years as I have in the past. Have taken on a number of other affiliations and have really taken seriously mentoring both in the NBA as well as outside of it in the events and sports industry.
Yeah, real quick. I guess now that we have those things talked about, we'll just get back into the NBA. Like we were about to talk about, would you be able to describe how to get to NBA executive vice president of events as a woman in a male-dominated sport and a male-dominated environment in total?
So I'd like to think that it's not just male-dominated anymore with the WNBA as well as the 2K League and some of our prominent draftees this year recently in the 2K League were women as well. There are a number of people in the sports and entertainment industry that are strong women, and I'm fortunate to count myself among them. I don't think that there's much different from my perspective for a woman than a man that is any replacement for hard work and hustle. Mm-hmm. I come from a family of 4. I have 3 brothers. And I learned early on in my life that you got to have a loud and strong voice, and you don't get what you don't ask for. So that's something that has been a cornerstone of everything I've done throughout my career.
Absolutely. And so then as a role model, I guess, for like women in high positions in male sports, particularly, have there been any kind of challenges then that you've noticed or faced? I'm sure you've had this question before, you thought about it before. And if so, what kind of challenges were there?
I've been doing this 30 years now, and certainly it's been an evolution over time. There are still days where I'll walk into a crowded boardroom and I'll be the only female in the room. But I've always bet on myself. I've always been confident in what I do day to day and my opinions. And so sure, there are challenges every day, but there's challenges for everyone. No one knows what it's like to walk in someone's shoes. And that's something that I truly believe in. I, again, come from a very strong family that raised me to believe there wasn't anything I couldn't do. And that's helped me get through each day. I think there's no one in life that doesn't have challenges. It's just how we face them each day. And I've been really fortunate to work with and for people who have been incredibly supportive of my journey and pushed me along the way.
Absolutely. And kind of going off, facing challenges each day. So the NBA campus, or commonly known as the bubble, so that was probably one of the biggest things that we've seen in sport, and God knows how long, right? So, and I know you were a great part in making all that happen. So would you be able to kind of walk us through what the decision-making process of building that was last year?
Sure. So I think it's been said before, there was no blueprint for a pandemic and no blueprint for restarting the NBA season. And so it was then and still is today a very collaborative effort in everything we do at the league. And in building the plan for the restart, we worked across every department and functionality in the league, from communications, basketball operations, player matters, marketing, our marketing partnerships group. I mean, dozens of people came together to make sure that we turned over every rock possible to be able to plan out how we could safely and with health as our priority, put 22 teams onto a single campus and build a basketball city. And I think that was one of the key things that came out of how we were able to accomplish it, and is a legacy of what we take forward in every day. And what we're doing now is we still, take one step at a time to come out of the pandemic that we still find ourselves in.
Right. And so I also wanted to ask this real quick. So I know players like Chris Paul, they were also very active in working with you to kind of make a lot of this happen over the last year. Were there a lot of other players that were helping the NBA office as well, kind of making this happen?
We were so incredibly fortunate to have player engagement in designing this campus at Disney World. And it really was a privilege to be able to present to them. We had Zoom after Zoom and phone calls and presented plans and got their feedback and tweaked and made improvements, not just every day leading up to our arrival in Orlando, but every day when we were in Orlando. And I think that that's a really important takeaway as it relates to collaboration and building something that really worked in Orlando and also worked in Bradenton when we did the WNBA bubble, referred to as the Wubble, and then followed by the G League bubble back at Disney World, affectionately referred to as the Gubble, which is we took feedback from everywhere and anywhere, but certainly the player feedback was hugely important to what we were able to develop. And it's one thing to see it in two-dimensional renderings. It's another one to be able to see it three-dimensionally. And so we were committed every day to taking player feedback and improving the experience for during the NBA restart. What was more than 100 days for the teams that went to the finals.
So the last question that the question before this, you mentioned about there not being a blueprint as to this pandemic and how everything kind of played out. You actually told Fortune that there was no playbook or blueprint for this. Would you be able to describe how the league will go forward now then, post-bubble? As far as is there any kind of, barring this kind of situation happens again, is there now a blueprint, quote?
I think that there's learnings in everything we do that prepare us for what comes next. Mm-hmm. I would say that when we did the first India games in Mumbai a year and a half ago, it's hard to imagine that it's been that long, and also that was just a year and a half ago. There are so many things we do here at the league, and it's one of the things that gives me energy every single day, which is we're always pushing the envelope to do something we've never done before. Not sure that I would ever ask for a pandemic. Yeah. I know I wouldn't. And I hope we don't have something quite as challenging as we're facing around the world as we see right now. But I'm confident that whatever situation comes up next, we'll take the cornerstones of what we did in the bubble and we'll apply them consistently to everything we do in the future. And for me, there are 3 elements to that apply to every situation and every program that we develop and execute here at the league. And it's communication, collaboration, and one that I didn't expect to find, which was community. And it truly was a community that we built in Orlando. Imagine living with your colleagues and all of the competitive nature that comes from what's happening on the court around the clock for over 100 days. Certainly a unique experience.
Yeah, I completely hear you there. And kind of going back on the community part that you just said there. So fans would be considered part of the community, right?
Sure. I mean,
Okay.
we play for the fans.
Right. And so I just want to see, like, at least from a front office perspective, how did not having fans in the bubble in 2020 kind of affect the season?
So we put fans as one of our, key priorities as well in terms of how would we engage fans, and it was through an innovative lens and a lot of input from a lot of people across the league to be able to create virtual fans. We knew that it was hugely important to us to bring our fans courtside, and we've done that in many ways throughout the years in innovative platforms like virtual reality and augmented reality. And what we did during the restart, without the opportunity to have fans there live and in person, was create the next best thing, which was virtual fans. And it's something that when we went back to our home arenas, we did as well. And we created a similar setup when we played the All-Star game earlier this month in Atlanta. So our fans are hugely important to us around the world. And such a large number of our fans will not be able to sit courtside live at a game in the US and Canada. But now with technology, we can bring those fans courtside, and the virtual fan program, I think, is something that's here to stay.
And so kind of going off that virtual fan program, would you want other leagues to kind of follow in the NBA's footsteps here? Because I believe that's an ingenious idea by the NBA. So I just wanted to know if you think that other leagues such as like the NFL, MLS, anything like that has, large gatherings, especially while we're still in the midst of the pandemic, would you encourage virtual fans and just everything else that the NBA kind of did, like, for the community?
I think innovation is key to the growth of any business. And I think one of the things that I've learned throughout my career in sports and entertainment is the importance of learning from what other people do. And we've learned a lot from each other across the sports leagues. We stay in very close contact with one another and help each other innovate and learn from one another. And that's something that I really enjoy about this industry, and I'll continue to lean on. So, we really do look to understand what it is that our fans want and then innovate around that.
Mental health was at a historical low throughout the 2020 season, with a 93% increase in anxiety and a 62% increase in depression. Garth Glissman, Vice President of NBA Basketball Operations, has more to say on mental health in the league and what the NBA was doing for the bubble residents.
All right, we now welcome on Mr. Garth Glissman of the NBA. How are you doing today, Garth?
I'm good. Jacob, Brock, thanks for having me.
For sure.
Thanks for having us, for sure.
So, knowing that the NBA bubble was kind of the first time anybody has seen any quarantine campus on that kind of scale throughout history, just because of the pandemic and everything, one question I had, since a lot of those players were separated from their friends and family for most of the time, and families could only go to games at certain times too, did you see any noticeable changes within just the overall vibe of the league throughout the season last year?
Yes. It was an experience, that I think folks in hindsight have a different perspective on it than they did going into it. And, we're now at the time of filming this, we're almost exactly 1 year into the pandemic. And I was living in New York City, the epicenter of the pandemic, when it hit. And I think it's helpful to kind of look back and understand how perspectives have changed over the last year as society has learned more about the science underlying the pandemic. And, perhaps the best illustration of that is that in the first, we'll call it 7 weeks of the pandemic in New York, the focus was not on the airborne transmission of the virus, but it was on surfaces. And so for the first 7 or 8 weeks that my wife and I and our 2-year-old daughter were living in New York, which again was the epicenter of it all, we were encouraged by medical professionals not to wear masks. And instead we were worried about picking it up by, touching surfaces. And so I just mentioned that, albeit a little bit of a tangent to start, to illustrate the point that our knowledge of the virus and even the evolution of the virus itself has changed dramatically over the last year. So the decision to enter the bubble, as it became known, we officially referred to it as the NBA campus, but that decision was largely made in, we'll call it late spring of 2020. And at the time, it was certainly the best decision for our league. And it was really a no-brainer in the sense that we, at the time, based on medical advice, concluded that it was really the only way for us to operate. So there's a distinction to be made between the decision you make based on the information you have at the time in April, May, some of the decision-making processes stretched into June a little bit. The team started to arrive in the bubble shortly after the 4th of July. So by July, the decisions had been made. But the point is, hindsight's 2020. We've learned a lot about the virus since then, and we've learned a lot about what life in a bubble, meant for our teams and our players. That informs our judgment today. But again, our judgment today is very different than it was almost a year ago. And I would add to that the fact that our country throughout 2020, in addition to a once-in-a-century pandemic, was in the midst of unprecedented social unrest. And you think back to the social issues that dominated much of 2020, and that was really reached a new level in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd. And so there was no way for us to know heading into the bubble and before some of those incidents happened that would also come to define 2020. And of course, when we look back on it, it all makes sense. But at the time, we were focused on the pandemic and finding really what we thought was the only way to operate at that time. So I make those distinctions to kind of frame our discussion. All that said, looking back on the bubble and what was asked of our teams and league personnel and being away from society, really, for months at a time in an isolated environment, it was no doubt, in hindsight, a tough stretch for everybody involved. And I think everyone associated with the NBA is very empathetic to some of the challenges that our teams and league office employees endured last season and this season as well. But again, you have to look at it through the prism of being making decisions that were the best decisions at that time based on the information available to us at that time.
For sure, right. Yeah, because we saw a lot just changing with the pandemic. Like, just all the news going on last March between May. Everything was flip-flopping back and forth information-wise. So honestly, I thought personally it was the best move was to kind of wait until the facts were out there about what was going on. So rock good.
And so I guess now that you've just been talking a lot about how, unprecedented it was and you're doing the best with what you had, that's pretty much the best thing you could have been doing. Me and Jacob kind of talked about this earlier. God forbid we have another pandemic in 100 years. Has the league sort of been working on a protocol of any kind, or is there any kind of plan in place for something it may not even be a pandemic, but just another NBA bubble protocol? Is there anything like that you guys have been discussing?
Well, it's a good question. So, the first thing that I would say is that the last year has taught us that bubbles work. Yeah. So our bubble worked from a COVID standpoint, and ultimately from an operational standpoint, we were able to accomplish what we set out to do, which was to crown a champion. And we have created a second bubble that's currently almost reached the finish line, the G League bubble at the same location in at Disney World near Orlando, Florida. So our first bubble worked. The WNBA wubble, as it was known, that was successful. The G League has been successful from a health and safety standpoint. To my knowledge, there haven't been any positive cases. So I think you have to acknowledge that from a COVID standpoint, bubbles, I think it's fair to say, still are the best option, right? Mm-hmm. That if your primary focus and the risk you're guarding against is just COVID, then a bubble is the way to go. And I think you've seen policymakers and college athletics come to a similar conclusion. They were unfortunately for them, just based on the timing of when the pandemic hit last year, they were not able to conclude their season. And so obviously it gives additional importance to this season, and they really need to, for a variety of reasons, make sure that they're able to, have a tournament and crown a champion this year. And so it's kind of like when all your chips are being pushed to the middle of the table and you need a sure thing, a bubble is a proven path. What we learned as 2020 progressed, and it was, in my view, accentuated by a lot of the social issues that were taking place throughout the country, is that we are multidimensional human beings. We live in a multidimensional society. And although COVID is certainly transformed the way people all across the world live, it's not the only risk that societies are navigating and balancing. And our commissioner, Adam Silver, often talks about it being a balancing act. And that, again, if you were, taking outside of the basketball context, if you were only focused on COVID, policymakers across the world, they would just shut society down. They would lock people in their homes and say, stay home until a vaccine is ready. Well, you can come out of your house to get vaccinated, and that'll be our way through the pandemic. We won't lose any lives. And so from a COVID standpoint, that would be the best way to operate. But we all know in the real world, that's not how things operate. And the decisions that you're seeing made from government leaders all across the world, and in the United States, a state-by-state approach is trying to balance the risks. And one of the risks I think that we now have a better appreciation for as a society, and that we didn't perhaps fully understand on the front end of the pandemic, is mental health, right? And that human beings, we're social creatures. We're meant to be around, for most people, meant to be around other people, have some form of social interaction to kind of go through normal daily activities, whether it's school, whether it's work, go to church, athletic activities, whatever it may be. And the reality is, when you take all of those opportunities away from people, that we're seeing, the data shows that it's having a negative effect on mental health, particularly for young people. And so that's not the only risk. It's not just COVID and mental health, but that's just an example of other risks and other factors that need to be considered. And it becomes this balancing test, and you're constantly trying to strike the right balance. And it's an ongoing process, because the threat of the virus evolves, right? And the infection rates have evolved over time. Now it's the threat calculus, the risk calculus is a little different because we have some vaccines coming online. So it's a balancing act. And that's one thing that I think our commissioner has done a really nice job of capturing is the fact that there are no absolutes. There's no perfect way to handle a pandemic. It is a constant balancing of a variety of risks. So to answer your question is, God forbid we, experience another pandemic. I think it's fact specific, right? And this pandemic, in terms of how it affected society, disproportionately affecting the elderly population was actually very different than the pandemic of 1918, which disproportionately affected young, healthy adults. So that changes the calculus as well. So it really is, I think, fact specific, and you just have to do the best you can with the information available to you at the time to to make the best decision and strike the appropriate balance.
Right. And you real quick, I noticed he mentioned mental health, and you did a real good piece on that just a second ago, and you were talking about that. That was another part that we wanted to hit pretty hard on in this interview, is like mental health of players and even yourself or people that worked for the NBA at the time. Like, how were those players and staff coping with not being able to see their families? You know, they're without their families for months at a time in the bubble, and or being able to play in front of them. Like, how was that?
So the NBA, I think one of the things that we're proud of as a league is we've been very progressive in trying to shine a light on mental health as a societal issue, and something that even outside of a pandemic that we as a society should be more focused on than before. And that's actually an issue that has started to take on greater significance for me when I was a coach. Before I came to the league office, I was an attorney in Omaha, and then on the side, I volunteered as a head high school coach. And just seeing the pressures on young people today, and just studying the data and recognizing that, mental health issues, that there has been an increase in this country, and it's, I think, been especially acute among high school and college aged individuals. So we have created a culture in the NBA where it's okay to talk about those things, which I'm very proud of. I think that's there's a lot of reasons that I'm proud to work for the NBA, but that's certainly near the top of the list. And so some of our players have been very open about their own mental health struggles, and I don't want to speak for those players because I think it's best when they're able to speak for themselves in an authentic way. But some players have been open about the fact that the bubble took a toll on their mental health and impacted their performance. One player who's made public comments on that is Paul George. And so I would, encourage you to take a look at Paul's comments, just because, Paul's going to be able to speak for himself better than I can. But I'm proud that, the NBA has done its part to surface mental health issues as a societal issue. And I would just say that it didn't take long for us to realize that we needed to be mindful of the mental health strain that living in a bubble apart from society was having on everybody. So we were, I think it's fair to say, pretty quick to react in terms of providing mental health resources for our players. We had mental health clinicians who were actually living in the bubble, devoted resources for our players, staff, anybody in the bubble had the ability to access these individuals. And then in time, we actually staffed up even further and made some resources available remotely, so that we had more professionals who were available. Obviously, there are some limitations in terms of getting folks on site, but that was a big focus of ours, to provide mental health resources to everybody on campus. And then we, over time, continued to add to those resources. And actually, as we got closer to the playoffs and teams had been there even longer, we encouraged teams, if they hadn't already, to bring down their dedicated team mental health clinician. Many of our teams have full-time mental health clinicians or performance psychologists on staff, and so we encourage teams, if they hadn't already, many of them already had, but if they hadn't already, we encouraged teams to make sure that their mental health professionals were on site in the bubble.
That's awesome. I was actually going to ask you if you guys had like clinicians and professionals and psychologists working on those staffs. But yeah, that's awesome to hear that. Like, that is
just one point to sorry to interrupt you there, Jacob. Just one point on that, because I can tell you guys are focused on this point. So one of the many things we did to prepare for the bubble was we had Zoom calls like this with all 30 NBA teams and the referees, and the coaches. So every stakeholder group that was going to the bubble had a Zoom orientation meeting that focused on kind of what the bubble experience would be like. And within those orientation meetings, we had a dedicated, mental health section. It was among many other topics, so I don't want to overstate it. But the point of these orientation meetings was just to, again, let people know that the resource was available. So going in, the day they arrived on campus, they knew that mental health resources were available, and that goes for every stakeholder group. That was for coaches, players, referees, team staff, you name it. So they knew that going in, and then we just, we even added to those resources over time.
Okay. And this is my last question too. So, quick stat. So there was a 93% increase in anxiety between 2019 and 2020, and then like another 62% increase in depression. So, going aside from the players too, were you guys seeing a lot of effects of that in just the front office, so in your field, and then do you know any other like staffers or journalists even that were inside the bubble that it might have affected worse? Because players were kind of getting a lot of these options, but were there any staffers or journalists or just anyone that was part of that faculty? Were they also getting access to those resources?
Everyone had access to those resources. Certainly teams are structured in such a way that players have oftentimes access to the most resources, whether it's a traditional athletic trainer to get them physically ready to play. But certainly I think it's fair to say that everyone living in the bubble had access. And in fact, to mental health resources. And in fact, we had a daily health check on smartphones. So to get on the bubble, you had to download an app. And the app had daily questions. Most of them were COVID related, as you would imagine. But eventually we added mental health related questions to the app. So essentially asking people, every day to kind of self-check whether they had COVID symptoms or whether they had mental health issues that, they felt warranted consultation with a mental health professional. So that was part of a routine every morning for every person on campus. It was, integrated into our broader health and safety protocols. So again, this is an area where I think the NBA can really stand tall. We've been very progressive in terms of, the first issue to mental health is just raising awareness and trying to destigmatize it. And we've done that before the pandemic. Our commissioner has been, very forward thinking on it. He made some public comments at the Sloan Analytics Conference in the spring. I can't remember if it was 2019 or 2020. You could fact check me on that. But, he talked about, the mental health pressures, broadly speaking, that our players face. And that actually at the time created news because most of society looks at NBA players and they're making millions of dollars and they would think, oh, these guys have it all. And so there was kind of, different reactions to the commissioner's comments, but I can tell you from my own experience that he was exactly right. And that there are unique pressures that NBA players experience that have an impact on mental health. I think there are other subsets of the population who also, for different reasons, have mental health challenges. And I think college students, are another example. They're away from home. They're under pressure to do well academically, to try to position themselves to get a good job after graduation or get into the graduate school they want. And so I think there's some parallels there. So to answer your question, we certainly didn't limit our mental health awareness to the players, and we certainly didn't limit the availability of those resources to players only. It was available to anyone on the campus, and it's been a priority of ours before the pandemic. It's been a priority throughout, and I can promise you it'll be a priority after. And again, I think it's something that the NBA should be very proud of. I don't pretend to be a mental health expert. And so I can study the data that you guys cited and you have access to as well. I can tell you just based on my own experiences, having worked with youth as a coach and now where I sit at the NBA league office, I do think it's becoming an increased issue for us as a society. And I hope that as a society that we can continue to destigmatize it, to encourage people to think about their mental health like they do their physical health, to get help when they need to get help, to understand that actually in many cases getting help is not a sign of weakness, but it's a sign of incredible internal strength, to recognize that, hey, something's not right, and I need to take an affirmative step to try to address it. I think particularly for young men and young men who are athletes, it can be hard to admit some vulnerability or weakness. And so this is continued to be an area of focus for the NBA, but I think it transcends basketball, and my hope is that the NBA can be a leader in sparking broader mental health awareness across all of society.
Yeah, for sure.
I think it's really great that you guys did all that kinds of stuff, because that's definitely not something that the public saw or the public really knew about. Is all this, especially in the bubble, people definitely overlooked that mental side of things. Like you said, there are players that make millions of dollars. Nobody's really thinking too much about how they're, what's going on in their mind, or maybe problems at home or problems with family. People don't think about that. So I think that's really cool that you guys definitely did that for them. But I had one more question for you, Garth. This is kind of a little bit different subject, a little bit changed, but so how are the effects of last year's bubble carrying over into this season, mentally, physically? Like the Lakers and the Heat, the shortest off season in NBA history, for those two teams specifically, or any team in the bubble really. It's just obviously different. So were there any effects, and like how are the effects carrying over?
Well, I think effect number one is that we're not in a bubble this year.
Yeah, obviously, right.
Sometimes the most obvious observations can be the most powerful, and I think, and that's kind of the point that I was making earlier. With, at the time, the bubble was the right decision, but in hindsight, our players had no interest in going back into a bubble, especially for a whole season. Right. And so that's why we've made the choice to operate the way we are now, which is, we're operating our league as part of society, subject to very stringent health and safety protocols, prioritizing health and safety as much as we can. But we haven't sought to create this essentially, quarantined environment. So I think the biggest takeaway from the bubble and the effect that it had on our players and team personnel, broadly speaking, is that we're not in a bubble this year. And that speaks to the balancing that our commissioner has continued to focus on, and the need to account for more considerations and risks than just COVID. Although as a society, we continue to navigate this very horrific pandemic, we also continue to be multidimensional human beings who have a variety of, fundamental needs. And so I think we're perhaps, indexing a little bit more to the social science side this year, as opposed to some of the hard sciences. We've accepted the fact that there are going to be some positive cases among our players and team personnel this year, and that's, the natural byproduct of operating outside of a bubble. But we collectively, in partnership with our Players Association, and again, everything we do is in partnership with our Players Association, and arrived collectively at a decision that this is the best path for us, knowing what we do now. But the league is still, look, we're still tired. We're still, I think, just much like society, we're worn down. We're a year into this, pandemic, and I think it's weighing on people in a lot of ways, and the NBA is not immune to the challenges that all of society is facing.
So are there hopes for are there better mood among players? Are there hopes for possibly fans, or in the future? Is that like is there a sense of optimism?
So about half of our league has allowed fans already through the first half of the season, and that the number of teams that allow fans will continue to increase as government policies across the country allow. So it will start to look more normal. We are, as a society, as of the day of us filming this, we are approaching 100 million vaccine doses. Of course, 2 of the 3 vaccines are 2-shot vaccines, and the science suggests that you need to be at least 2 weeks removed from your second shot for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines in order to be fully inoculated. So we're making progress as a society in terms of the vaccine rollout. President Biden has publicly said that by the end of May, all healthy adults will be eligible for vaccines. There are still questions that remain around, what's the process for children, pregnant women, whether these are vaccines that we need to get on an annual basis, like the flu shot. There's still some uncertainty in the data as to whether a vaccinated individual could still transmit the virus. And so there's still a fair amount to learn there, but it's safe to say that our league is starting to look more normal, and hopefully as we approach our playoffs, which are scheduled to start this year in late May, or I should say the second half of May, that'll look even more like normal. And hopefully by the start of next year, call it October, November of 2021, that we're almost completely back to normal. But again, a lot of that depends on the science, the evolution of the virus. We're monitoring these new variants, and we're monitoring the efficacy of the vaccine relative to the new variants. So there's still, there are a lot of unknowns, but we're optimistic. We've already made a lot of progress since we got through the very significant uptick in infections in the immediate aftermath of the holidays, and we just hope to keep the momentum going.
Not only were jobs in the NBA campus directly affected, others, such as the media, were taken back by the damage COVID did to our livelihoods. Chuck Cooperstein, the play-by-play voice of the Dallas Mavericks, speaks to us about how his career and others were affected by the pandemic. All right, we now welcome on Mr. Chuck Cooperstein, who is the voice of the Dallas Mavericks in the NBA. Chuck, how are you doing today?
All good, guys. How are you?
Great. So, I hope your bracket's still going well and everything after this weekend.
Nobody's bracket is doing well.
Yeah. Not even, no. I had Illinois, so that kind of crumbled for me about a couple hours ago.
Yeah. I won the final. I lost 8 games the first day, so at that point, I just basically gave up.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Yeah, I don't think we'll have any more perfect ones after this weekend. But anyway, so Chuck, so as the voice of the Dallas Mavericks currently doing the play-by-play, so how is your position affected by the pandemic after the bubble's creation in the NBA?
Well, it was affected greatly. Number one, we didn't travel with the team. Number two, because we weren't traveling with the team, you had limited access to the players and the coaches and the not that you always spent a tremendous amount of time around them, but you spent enough time around them that you really had a feel for what was going on. That feel was lost. That you were doing games off of monitors, and granted, I had as good a setup as I could possibly ask for, but it's still not the same as seeing it with your own eyes, because you're a slave to the director, the TV director. He's going to show what he wants to show. And there's just too many things that happen behind the play, especially at the scores table when you're looking for officials' clarifications and things like that. And you just don't know. And, just from a production standpoint, it's just not the same, as hearing a real crowd. When you're getting fake crowd noise and whatever. I mean, having some of the effects is all right. When your nets and rims are mic'd and things like that, that's all well and good. But, to not be able to, get that feeling from the crowd one way or the other, good or bad, it made it extremely challenging.
Okay, so kind of what you're describing, it wasn't like alive.
I'm sorry?
Yeah.
It didn't feel like alive like it used to.
You couldn't feed off the fans or anything, yeah.
I mean, look, I'm a pretty energetic guy, and I think I can bring games to life regardless if there are fans in the stands or not. It's more difficult to do it without fans, because you definitely, you're feeding off the adrenaline that they have and the emotion that's in the building. And frankly, during the bubble and for a lot of the early part of the NBA season of 2021, there's just not been a whole lot of emotion because until recently, there were very few people that were actually, having fans be allowed in their buildings. And, right now, the maximum is about 25% capacity for teams in the league.
Yeah, Brock and I actually can kind of relate to that because he and I are both part of the broadcasting department for the athletic department here. So when we're filming live games and stuff like that for basketball, it's just definitely not the same not having any fans there to, get everybody pumped up or anything like that.
Especially in Memorial Stadium for Husker football when we'd be down there filming games.
Sure.
When we have 90,000 seat stadium, it's like almost dead silent. So it's definitely not ideal. We could totally relate for sure.
So, and then, so did you have like a journalistic aspect covering games remotely? So did you have to cover any games from home over the course of the bubble?
Never did it from home. We do all our games from the American Airlines Center. In the bubble, we did it actually from the Mavericks locker room. We had it set up really well in there. And that was good because, at least there's carpet on the floors and there's some sound absorption that's going on. Right now, we've either done games from the practice floor, but we've given that up. And now we're actually working out of a very small room that we had to add, blankets that moving companies would use, for when you're moving someone, to try to put them up and put them around the wall so the sound won't bounce around. But, it's even now, I can tell, when there's a big moment in a road game and I'm trying to really bring it, you can hear the fact that I'm in a room. And, and the first time even I really noticed it was in game 4 against the Clippers when Luka Doncic hit his game-winning shot. I punched it as I should have punched it, but you could definitely tell that I was not live. Or at least, let's put it this way. I know I could tell that I wasn't live when I listened back to it. How others consume it, I can't really say, but it was very obvious to me, and it's even frankly, given that our room is smaller and there's less sound absorption in that room, it is what it is. I realize it's such a trite saying now, but we're trying to do the best that we can do with what's given to us. But there's no question in my mind anyway, that the home games that we do, where we have our full crew, full stat crew, and doing it out in the open in the arena is a far better broadcast than what we're doing for the road games.
Okay, yeah, kind of going based off that, is there any plan to get you guys completely situated back onto the court? Well,
it's like, as I say, for home games, we're in the building. Okay. We do the games live. For the road games, I haven't heard anything, but I think most of the scuttlebutt is that we're all hoping that by next season, that we'll be back. We'll be traveling and back in buildings.
For sure.
Awesome.
Brock, did you have something?
I had a quick one then. So what are journalists sort of doing or preparing to do if another quarantine campus kind of happens? Like, is there any protocol or anything that you're aware of that they're forming?
None that I know of. If there's, the league has pretty much done what they did last year in the bubble. We have, all media gatherings are via Zoom, and really that's the only access that we have to players. As opposed to, again, when we're on the road and, not again that we're hanging out with them, but, we certainly could be spending more time with them, just bump into them in the hotel or even on the floor before the game as they're shooting, and maybe they're taking a break and they're sitting on the bench and you can talk to them, or after a shoot around or something like that. None of that exists. And so, really what's happened now is not very much different than what's happened in the bubble. And so I can't imagine that things would change dramatically if, other than we wouldn't be playing games. I think that would be the biggest change if somehow there was a re-quarantine, if you will.
I guess I had one other quick question. Is there anything like, I'm assuming you have a routine, like a game plan before games normally. Is there anything that changed in that game plan or in that routine once you became remote, or did it get easier for you once you became remote?
No, I mean the prep is the prep.
Mm-hmm.
At least for me, and it's
Mm-hmm.
I don't change how I do games.
Mm-hmm.
It's really in the actions leading. It's in the actions once the game and once the broadcast actually begins. I mean, I'm still trying to give you a sense of what is around the team. Good trends, bad trends. Some people don't necessarily like to hear the bad trends, but the fact they are there, and they ultimately can tell a story, and that's my job is it's a storyteller, it's a reporter, it's a marketer, it's it's an excitement builder, it's all of those things, and from that standpoint, it hasn't changed. But the prep that I do for a game when I know there's going to be 20,000 people in the building is no different from the prep that I'm doing tonight. For our game with Portland that I'll be doing remotely.
Yeah. And so have you heard of the mental health initiative going around the NBA ever since the bubble started? Okay. So what are your thoughts on how they're kind of going based off that? Because one of our angles for this story is kind of just the awareness of mental health that the NBA is trying to raise. So coming from your perspective, what is your opinion on the mental health, coaches and counselors that's going on with players and anybody in the bubble residents?
Look, anyone who needs to talk to someone should have that available to them. Mm-hmm. And the Mavericks have been way ahead of that game for a long time. We've traveled a staff psychologist for years that could be talked to about anything, whether it be I've lost my confidence because the ball's not going to the basket, to my life's a mess right now. That guy has always been available to them. And the fact that other teams and the league as a whole are supporting that initiative, what can be bad about that? It's nice to see a little bit of enlightenment, if you will.
Yeah, I agree. So Chuck, I just got one more question for you. So what is your advice to any journalist going into the NBA after, post bubble? What advice do you have for anybody going into broadcasting or journalism, towards live sports such as the NBA?
I mean, as far as what? I mean, what do you
as far as just kind of being able to adapt to situations such as the past 365 days, staying.
I mean, I think we've already adapted in certain ways. I don't think any of us like it. I think people, pretty much all of us who have been in the business for a long time, want us to go back to the way it was. People can say, progress for the sake of progress isn't necessarily progress. It's there's a reason why. You don't necessarily want to say we do things just because we've always done things that way. But there are things that clearly we've seen that are far better for broadcasters and writers than they are right now. Our lack of access is really quite troublesome to me. But it's not like you can necessarily fight it. I mean, you just have to hope that the leagues and the media entities will all see the light and understand that our ability to get as close as we can get to the athletes and to the coaches makes for better reporting, makes for better understanding, and frankly, makes for I think it's a better game. It's a better product for the league to sell ultimately than what they have right now. There's a lot of things that we have in the NBA that are absolutely fantastic, but there's no question that other than reading things or seeing things just by watching games. I mean, I look at myself right now as just a slightly more educated than usual fan. I'm more educated than the usual fan because I have, I'll take the time to go through, all the stats and all the notes and try to find these things out. Just from what's out there that everybody else can see. I'm really in many ways no different than the person who's watching the game, other than the fact that I've got a really big TV in front of me, and I've got I've got my voice to use. Not that's really the only advantage that I have right now. The bigger advantage comes when I actually have access, and hopefully that'll come back to us.
For sure. Very good
Absolutely.
answer. Brock, did you
Yeah,
have
that made perfect sense. No, that made perfect sense. I like that at the end where you talked about how you're really not a big step up in front of everybody rather than the knowledge part of it. The NBA showed great innovation with the bubble. Not only were fans a part of a new experience, but lives were also saved in the process. COVID itself has wronged the world in many ways, and no one has seen this in recent history. Due to the bubble's creation, sports were able to live on and continue to do so. From Unlimited Sports, thank you for listening.